Can you cook? The question landed in the middle of the great hall, like a stone dropped into still water. Every head turned, every breath held. Bonnie stood at the altar, if one could call it that, a raised platform of cold gray stone draped in white linen that smelled of candle wax and someone else's perfume, and she felt the words before she understood them, felt them in the hollow of her chest, in the trembling of her fingers wrapped around a bouquet of winter roses that had already begun to wilt. She had been waiting for different words. I take you. Or perhaps even silence. Even silence would have been kinder. The man standing across from her, Edmund Voss, her promised, her future, the alpha her father had selected with all the cold precision of a merchant calculating profit margins, was not looking at her when he spoke. He was looking past her, toward the door, toward the woman standing just inside it, wrapped in a traveling cloak the color of deep wine, her dark hair loose, her expression carrying the specific softness of someone who had been loved recently and well. Bonnie recognized her. She wished she didn't. Cecily Harrow, the daughter of the Western Pac's head physician. A woman Bonnie had met exactly 4 times, always at Edmund's side, always introduced as a family acquaintance, always watching Bonnie with eyes that held something Bonnie had mistaken for pity, and now understood was guilt. The hall was full. 140 guests, by the count she had made that morning while standing at her chamber window, watching carriages arrive in the courtyard below. Alphas and their mates, council members in formal gray, the elders of 3 packs seated in the front row with their silver-tipped walking canes and their ancient, unreadable faces. Her stepmother, Heloise, seated in the second row, wearing the pearl earrings that had belonged to Bonnie's mother, her expression composed into something that resembled maternal serenity and contained nothing of the sort. Bonnie's younger brother Theo was not present. He had not been permitted to attend. That detail, which had troubled her for 3 days, suddenly acquired a different weight. "Edmund," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that, distantly, the way one feels proud of a small thing when everything large is collapsing. "What are you doing?" He finally looked at her. There was no cruelty in his face, which was almost worse. There was only the mild discomfort of a man who had made a decision he considered reasonable and was now dealing with the inconvenience of explaining it. "I'm asking a practical question," he said. "The pack needs a Luna who can manage the household in times of shortage, who can work alongside the staff, who can—" "You're asking me this now." Not a question. A statement that contained everything she could not say aloud in front of 140 witnesses. "It occurred to me recently that I never asked." Recently. The word tasted like copper on her tongue. She looked at Cecily. Cecily looked at the floor. Somewhere behind Bonnie, a chair scraped. Someone coughed. One of the elders, she thought it was Elder Crane, the oldest, the one who had presided over her father's funeral and spoken about honor with a voice like dry parchment, made a sound that might have been disapproval or might simply have been age. Bonnie thought about her answer. She thought about it with the particular stillness that had always lived inside her, the stillness that Heloise had called coldness, and her father had called dignity. And Edmund, in the early months of their courtship, had called quietly extraordinary. She thought about the kitchens of Aldenmere, the pack house where she had grown up. How after her father died, she had spent 3 winters learning to make bread because the head cook had left, and the household budget, gutted by Heloise's spending, could not afford a replacement. She thought about the way dough felt beneath her palms, the particular resistance of it, and how satisfaction had a texture. She thought about the meals she had prepared in silence, alone, while Heloise hosted dinners in the upper rooms and introduced herself to visiting alphas as the Lady of Aldenmere, without once mentioning that the food on the table had been made by the dead lord's daughter. She thought about Theo, 12 years old and thin, eating everything she put in front of him and asking for nothing else. She thought about all of this in the span of perhaps 4 seconds. Then she set the wilting bouquet down on the linen-covered stone, smoothed the front of her ivory dress with both hands, and looked Edmund Voss directly in the eye. "Yes," she said. "I can cook. I have been cooking since I was 19 years old, because your future Luna's household was stripped of staff by a woman who spent my father's inheritance on silk and social ambition. I can cook bread, broth, preserved meats, winter stores, remedies for fever and remedies for cold. I can manage a kitchen of 20 and a budget of nothing. What I cannot do, it seems, is make you want to marry me." She paused. "So, we agree on something." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Edmund's jaw tightened. Cecily pressed her fingers to her mouth. Heloise, in the second row, went very still in a way that Bonnie recognized as the stillness before punishment. Not physical. Heloise had never needed to be physical. She had other methods. And Bonnie found that she did not care. There was a quality to not caring that she had never experienced before. It felt dangerously close to freedom. She stepped down from the platform. No one stopped her. They watched. The council members and the elders and the alphas with their mates. The servants standing along the walls with their hands folded and their eyes wide. And not one of them stepped forward. She passed within 3 feet of Elder Crane, and he did not speak. She passed Eloise's row, and did not look at her stepmother, and felt the woman's gaze like a hand reaching for her collar. She made it to the corridor before her legs began to shake. The corridor was cold. The great hall ran heat from 4 fireplaces, but the stone hallway beyond it belonged to winter, and she was wearing ivory silk with no sleeves and thin slippers meant for standing, not walking, and the shaking in her legs climbed her spine and reached her hands, and she pressed both palms flat against the wall and breathed. "Think," she told herself. "Think now. Fall apart later." Theo. She needed to get to Theo. Her brother had been placed in the East Wing guest quarters 3 days ago, when the household from Aldenmere had arrived. That was not unusual. What was unusual was that when she had tried to visit him the evening before the ceremony, the guard outside his door, not a Voss guard she had noticed, but one wearing the gray and silver of Heloise's private household, had told her that Master Theo was resting and not to be disturbed. She had told herself it was nerves, the preparation, the ceremony. She understood now, standing in the cold corridor with her hands flat on the stone and her breath making small clouds in the air, that it had not been any of those things. She pushed off the wall and moved. The East Wing was 3 corridors and a flight of stairs away. She knew the layout of Voss Hall the way she knew everything important. By necessity, by study, by the particular attention of someone who understood that knowledge was the one thing that could not be taken away. She had memorized the floor plan during the carriage ride here, from a page in her father's old journal that she had taken from Aldenmere the night before Heloise could catalog and confiscate it. She reached the East Wing stairs and heard voices. She stopped. 2 men, the gray and silver guard from the previous evening, and someone else. A voice she did not recognize, low and deliberate, with the flat affect of a man reading from a list rather than speaking. "Transfer happens after the ceremony is confirmed. The boy is collateral until then. Once the documents are signed and Voss controls the Aldenmere land title, the stepmother gets her payment and the girl." The cold in the corridor became a different kind of cold entirely. "What about the girl?" A pause. Then, "She won't be a problem. Voss knows what to do with a Luna who asks too many questions. The physician already has the preparation ready. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Grief is a natural thing." Bonnie did not move. She could not have said, afterward, how long she stood there. Long enough for the voices to fade. Long enough for her. "And I need to not be here when they notice." The man, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying no visible weapon and needing none, with the bearing of someone accustomed to rooms full of people who went quiet when he entered, reached up and removed the black wool cloak from his own shoulders without a word. He held it out to her. She stared at it. "I don't know who you are," she said. "No, he agreed. You don't. She took the cloak. Not because she trusted him. She didn't trust anyone in this building, and the last hour had done nothing to expand that category. She took it because it was wool, and she was cold, and she had approximately 18 minutes left before the hall realized the bride had walked out of her own wedding and sent someone after her, and standing in a corridor debating the motivations of a stranger was a luxury she did not have. The cloak was heavy. It smelled of cedar and cold air and something beneath both of those. Wood smoke, perhaps, or pine resin, or simply the particular warmth of a body that ran hotter than average. The way Shifters did. The way every alpha she had ever been near did. That specific animal heat that the body recognized before the mind caught up. She pulled it around her shoulders, and the hem dragged on the stone floor, and she did not care. East wing, she said. Second floor. There's a boy in the guest quarters with a gray and silver guard outside his door. He's 12. He comes with me. The man looked at her for a moment. Not assessing her exactly. More like he was listening to something she hadn't said yet. How many guards total in this wing? He asked. The question surprised her. Not who is the boy or what are you running from, or do you understand what you're asking? Just the practical, immediate thing, the useful thing. 2 on the east corridor, 1 on his door. I don't know the rotation. He nodded once. Stay close. Don't speak unless I tell you. I don't take instructions from men I haven't been introduced to. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Adrian, he said. Now you have. He turned and walked toward the east wing stairs, and she followed him because she had no better option, and she would not examine this too closely. Not now. There was something about the way he moved through the corridor that made the corridor feel like it belonged to him. Not arrogance, not performance. Simply the settled quality of a man who had walked into difficult rooms for a long time and had stopped being surprised by what he found in them. They reached the east corridor. 2 guards in gray and silver, standing at the far end near a window, talking in low voices. They looked up when Adrian entered the hallway, and she watched something happen in their faces. A recalibration, swift and involuntary, the specific expression of men who have just realized the person in front of them occupies a category of authority they were not prepared for. Adrian said nothing to them. He simply walked past them toward Theo's door as if the corridor were empty, as if their presence were a minor architectural feature, like a sconce or a decorative beam, and the men stepped aside with the instinctive deference of wolves, recognizing a rank that exceeded their own, before their minds had fully processed it. The guard outside Theo's door was different. Older, with the flat eyes of someone paid specifically to hold a line and trained not to be moved by social pressure or implicit authority. He put his hand on the door and looked at Adrian without stepping back. This room is restricted by order of... Move, Adrian said. 1 word. No volume behind it. No particular force. Just the absolute certainty of a man who had never in his adult life said a thing he didn't mean. The guard moved. Bonnie was through the door before it fully opened. Theo was sitting on the bed in his travel clothes, his boots still on, a book open on his knee that he was clearly not reading. He looked up when she entered, and the expression on his face, the relief, raw and immediate, poorly hidden behind 12-year-old dignity, cracked something open in her chest. Bonnie. He was off the bed and across the room in 3 steps. She caught him by the shoulders before he could say anything else, felt how thin he was beneath his jacket, felt the tension in him that was not childish restlessness, but something older and more frightened. Listen to me, she said quietly. We're leaving. Right now. Put the book down. I heard them talking last night, he said. His voice was low, steady, trying to be older than it was. Through the wall. The guard and someone else. They said, Bonnie, they said something about the physicians. I know. She kept her hands on his shoulders. I know. We're leaving. He looked past her at Adrian, standing in the doorway. Theo had their father's eyes, pale gray, observant, the kind of eyes that catalogued quietly. And those eyes moved over Adrian with the careful attention of a boy who had learned early that reading a room correctly was a survival skill. "Who is he?" Theo asked. "Someone who lent me a cloak," she said. "That's all I know." Theo considered this for exactly 2 seconds. Then he picked up his travel bag from beside the bed. Already packed, she noticed. Had been packed since he arrived, her brother who had also learned to read rooms, and slung it over his shoulder. "All right," he said. They went out through the servants' entrance on the ground floor, a narrow door half hidden behind a tapestry depicting some ancient Voss hunting victory. Stags and blood and triumphant men with torches. Adrian knew where it was without being told, which she noticed and stored away. The door opened onto a side courtyard, cobblestones slick with morning frost, the air sharp and clean after the candle-heavy warmth of the hall's interior. A carriage was waiting. Not a Voss carriage. The horses were dark, well-bred, already fitted with traveling tack, breath steaming in the cold air. The driver on the box was a broad-shouldered woman in a dark coat who glanced at Bonnie and Theo without surprise, and then looked back at the courtyard entrance with the alert stillness of someone keeping watch. Bonnie stopped walking. "You had a carriage waiting," she said. "Yes," Adrian said. "You came here expecting to leave quickly." "I came here expecting to find something that needed correcting." He said it without drama, without particular emphasis, the way one states a thing that is simply true. "Get in. The ceremony will have formally dissolved by now, and Voss will have noticed you're gone within the next few minutes. Heloise will notice sooner." "Where are you taking us?" He looked at her. In the pale winter light of the courtyard, without the shadow of the corridor, she could see him more clearly. The gray eyes, the sharp, unhurried quality of his face, the kind of face that had been tested by enough difficult things that it had stopped rearranging itself to manage other people's comfort. A scar, thin and old, running from the edge of his jaw toward his ear. The cloak was gone. She was wearing it, and beneath it he had on a dark riding coat, no insignia, nothing that announced rank or allegiance, which itself, she thought, was a kind of announcement. "North," he said, "to Carath." She knew that name. Everyone with any knowledge of the Northern Territories knew that name. Carath was the seat of the High Alpha, the oldest pack stronghold on the continent, the place where the Alpha King held court. She looked at him. He said nothing. He didn't need to. "Oh," she thought, and then, immediately after, "Of course." She got into the carriage. Theo climbed in after her. Adrian followed, settling across from them with the economy of movement of a man who had spent a great deal of time in carriages and had long stopped finding them anything other than functional. The driver touched the horses, and they moved, out of the courtyard through the servants' gate, onto the western road before anyone in the great hall had finished absorbing the fact that the wedding was over. For a while, no one spoke. Theo sat beside her with his travel bag on his knees and watched the frost-gray countryside move past the window. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and Adrian's cloak still wrapped around her shoulders and looked at nothing in particular. Then Theo said quietly, "They were going to poison her, weren't they?" It was not quite a question. Bonnie said nothing. "I heard them say the preparation," Theo said, "and grief is natural." "That's what they said. I wrote it down." He reached into his travel bag and produced a folded piece of paper, covered in his small, careful handwriting. "In case I needed proof." She took the paper from him. Her hands were steady. She was grateful for that. Adrian, across from them, watched this without speaking. She was aware of his attention the way one is aware of warmth from a fireplace. Not uncomfortable, not intrusive, simply present. He was not performing concern. He was not offering reassurance. He was simply paying attention. and there was something about being paid attention to by someone who clearly didn't need anything from her that felt entirely unlike every other kind of attention she had received in the past several years. "Why were you at Voss Hall?" she asked him. Not aggressively, just the direct practical question. "Council business," he said. "The Voss Pack has been under review for land appropriation in the northern counties. I was there to deliver a formal inquiry. What I found instead was considerably more urgent." "How much did you hear?" "Enough." A pause. The physician's daughter, the guard's conversation on the east stair, the stepmother's arrangement regarding the Aldenmere title. He said it plainly, without softening it, and she appreciated that more than she could have explained. "Your stepmother has been selling information about your father's estate to the Voss Pack for 3 years. The arrangement was that Voss would marry you, wait a sufficient period, and then the land and mining rights attached to your father's title would transfer to Voss control through inheritance. You were not expected to survive long enough to contest it." Theo made a small sound. She put her hand on his arm briefly. "And Theo?" she asked. "Insurance. If you resisted or fled before the marriage was completed, the boy would be used to bring you back." He looked at Theo, and something in his expression shifted. Not softness, exactly, but a kind of deliberate steadiness directed at the boy. The look of a man who understood that 12-year-old ears were hearing adult information, and was choosing to speak to them with respect rather than evasion. "He was not in danger as long as you complied. He would have been released after the documents were signed." "And after I was gone," Bonnie said quietly. "He would have been placed in Heloise's custody. With the Aldenmere title dissolved, there would have been no estate, no income, no legal protection." Theo was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened his spine in a way that looked very much like their father, and said, "What happens now?" Adrian looked at Bonnie, not Theo, when he answered. "That," he said, "depends on what she wants." Kareth appeared on the second day of travel, rising out of the northern landscape the way old things rise. Not suddenly, but inevitably, as if the land had been building toward it for miles without announcing its intention. Bonnie saw it first through the carriage window in the gray light of late afternoon. Stone walls the color of charcoal. Towers that had been built to last rather than to impress. A ridge of dense pine forest behind them that made the whole structure look like something the mountain had grown, rather than something men had constructed. No banners, she noticed. Or rather, banners so dark they were nearly invisible against the winter sky, deep green and black, carrying a crest she recognized from her father's political journals as the seal of the High Alpha's seat. She had known, intellectually, since the courtyard. She had known who Adrian was. Knowing it intellectually, and arriving at his stronghold wrapped in his cloak, with her ivory wedding dress still on beneath it and her brother asleep against her shoulder, were different experiences, entirely. Theo woke when the carriage slowed at the outer gate. He looked through the window, then at Bonnie, then at Adrian with the measuring look he had been giving the man at intervals throughout the journey, quiet and careful, the way their father used to assess people he wasn't sure of yet. "It's very large," Theo said. "Yes," Adrian said. "Do you live here alone?" "I have a household." Theo considered this. "Bonnie is a good cook," he said. "In case that's relevant." Bonnie closed her eyes briefly. "Theo, I'm just saying." Adrian said nothing, but when she opened her eyes he was looking at the window and there was something in the line of his jaw that might, in better circumstances, have been amusement. The inner courtyard of Kyarath was clean and cold, flagstones swept clear of frost, torches already lit in their iron brackets against the early dark. Stable hands appeared for the horses. The driver, whose name, Bonnie had learned during a brief stop on the first day, was Sarah, and who had the efficient manner of someone who had been solving logistical problems for a very long time, was already down from the box and speaking to a man in a dark coat who appeared to be expecting her. A woman came out of the main entrance as they descended from the carriage. Middle-aged, gray-streaked hair pulled back severely, wearing the practical dress of someone who managed large things with small fuss. She looked at Adrian first, then at Bonnie and Theo with an expression that gave nothing away and absorbed everything. "My housekeeper," Adrian said. "Marin. She'll see to rooms and clothing." He looked at Bonnie. "You need to rest, both of you. We can discuss the rest tomorrow." "I'd rather discuss it now," Bonnie said. "You've been sitting in a carriage for 2 days in a wedding dress. You haven't slept. Neither have you. I'm accustomed to it. So am I." He looked at her. She looked back. She was aware, with some detached part of her mind, that she was standing in the courtyard of the Alpha King's stronghold, wearing his cloak over an ivory dress that was never going to be worn for its intended purpose, arguing with him about whether she was tired, and that this was possibly not the most dignified moment of her adult life. She was also aware that she was not going to back down, and that he seemed to understand this, because after a moment he said, "1 hour. After you've eaten." She conceded that much with a nod. Marin showed them inside with the brisk warmth of a woman who had received unexpected guests at strange hours, enough times to have made peace with it. She spoke to Theo directly, which Bonnie appreciated. Too many adults addressed children through the nearest available adult, as if the child were a piece of luggage. And Theo, who was reserved with strangers by long habit, responded to being taken seriously, with the same straightforward politeness he had learned from their father. The room prepared for Bonnie was on the 2nd floor. Stone walls, yes, and high windows, but also a fireplace that someone had clearly lit well in advance, a bed with heavy wool blankets, a basin of warm water, and clothing folded on the chair, a plain dark dress, warm stockings, a thick shawl. Nothing elaborate, nothing designed to impress. Just functional and clean, and the specific temperature of a room that had been prepared by someone who understood that warmth was not a luxury. She took off the wedding dress herself, let it fall in a heap of ivory silk on the stone floor. Did not look at it again. The dress Marin had left fit reasonably well, a little long, a little wide in the shoulder, but wool and warm, and nothing like what she had been wearing for 2 days. She washed her face and her hands and sat by the fire for exactly the time it took to eat the bread and broth that arrived on a tray carried by a young servant who smiled at her without guile and asked if she needed anything else with the straightforward cheerfulness of someone who had not yet learned to be afraid of guests. Then she went to find Adrian. She found him in a room off the main corridor that appeared to function as a working study. Bookshelves, maps pinned to a board, a desk covered in papers, a fire smaller than the one in her room. He was standing at the window with a cup of something hot in his hand, still in his riding coat, and he turned when she entered without appearing surprised. "You found it without asking directions," he said. "I paid attention when Marin walked us in." He gestured at the chair across from the desk. She sat. He remained standing, which she noticed. He hadn't seated himself in the dominant position across from her, hadn't placed the desk between them like a barrier. He was simply in the room, occupying it the way he occupied every space, with that particular quality of presence that didn't reach for anything. "Tell me about Aldenmere," he said, so she told him. She told him about her father, a good man, a careful alpha, not powerful in the political sense but respected, who had managed a modest territory with fairness, and died slowly of a lung illness over the course of 3 winters, while Eloise managed his correspondence, and his visitors, and his affairs, with increasing authority. She told him about the mining rights attached to the Aldenmere land, iron deposits in the northern hills that her father had left undeveloped by choice, because the cost to the surrounding villages would have been too high. She told him about the year after the funeral, when Eloise had begun negotiating with outside parties, and the household staff had begun disappearing one by one, replaced by people who answered to Eloise alone. She told him about Theo, who had been pulled from his tutoring and given instead a series of increasingly useless lessons designed to keep him occupied and ignorant. She told him about Edmund Voss, whom she had met twice before the formal betrothal, and who had been pleasant and unremarkable, and who she had agreed to marry because there had been no alternative that protected Theo's position and her father's name simultaneously. She told him all of it in the same level tone she had used in the corridor of Voss Hall. Not because she felt nothing. She felt a great deal. It lived in the space behind her sternum like a banked fire. But because the telling was more useful than the feeling right now, and she had learned a long time ago to be useful first and feel later. When she finished, Adrian was quiet for a moment. "The land title is currently in dispute," he said. "Voss filed a preliminary claim 3 months ago, anticipating the marriage. Because you fled before the ceremony was completed, the claim has no legal basis. But Heloise holds your father's original documents, and if she's willing to forge—" "She is," Bonnie said. "She's been willing to do considerably worse than forgery. Then we need the original deed, which means we need access to Aldenmere." "I know where it is," Bonnie said. "My father kept his important documents in a locked chest in the library's lower shelf. The key was on his watch chain when he died. Heloise didn't know about the chest. My father showed it to me specifically, the week before he died, when he was still lucid enough to be deliberate about it. I think he suspected something. He told me the chest contained everything I would need to hold the estate." Adrian looked at her steadily. "And where's the key now?" She reached into the collar of the borrowed dress and drew out a thin chain she had worn against her skin for 2 years, from which hung a small iron key, worn smooth at the edges. He looked at the key, then at her face. "You've been carrying it since he died," he said. "I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know what yet." Another silence. Outside the window, the wind moved through the pine forest behind the stronghold, a long, low sound like breath. The fire shifted. She was tired, genuinely tired, the kind that lived in the bones. But she was not going to admit it in this room. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. It was the question she had been holding since the courtyard of Voss Hall. "You said council business, land disputes. You could have filed a report, sent an inquiry, handled it through channels. You didn't have to put us in your carriage." He set down his cup, looked at the fire. When he looked back at her, there was something in his expression that was more careful than anything she had seen from him yet, as if he were choosing his words with a precision that mattered to him. "There are things I could tell you," he said, "that you wouldn't believe yet. And I have enough respect for you to not say them before you're ready to hear them." A pause. "What I can tell you is that what happened in that hall was an injustice, and I have authority to correct injustices, and I intend to use it." She studied him. "That's a very clean answer. It's a true one. Clean and true aren't always the same thing." "No," he agreed. "They're not." She stood. The shawl slipped from her shoulder, and she caught it and pulled it back without looking away from him. "I want Aldenmere back. My father's name cleared. Heloise brought before a formal council on charges of fraud and conspiracy. And I want Theo's future secured. His education, his right to the secondary title that comes through our father's line. Those are my terms." He didn't blink. "All of those things are achievable." "I know they are. I'm not asking if they're achievable. I'm telling you what I want, so we both understand what this is." She looked at him directly. "I don't need saving, Adrian. I need resources and legal standing. Can you provide those?" The corner of his mouth moved again in that way that was almost but not quite a smile. "Yes," he said. "Then we have an arrangement." She moved toward the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, looked back at him over her shoulder. "And I'll return the cloak tomorrow, when I have something of my own to wear." She left before he could answer. She did not examine, as she walked back down the corridor toward the warm room and the fire and the heavy wool blankets. Why the sound of his silence behind her felt like something she wanted to carry with her. The first week at Caereth passed in the particular rhythm of a household that had learned to function around a man who kept his own hours and expected competence rather than ceremony from the people around him. Bonnie learned the stronghold the way she learned everything, methodically, by moving through it with attention. The kitchens were on the ground floor, large and well-supplied, run by a head cook named Osric, who was 60 years old, nearly completely deaf in one ear, and deeply opinionated about the correct temperature for proving bread dough. The library was on the 3rd floor, 2 rooms of it, organized with the specific logic of a mind that read widely and retrieved precisely. The great hall was used for formal occasions, and otherwise left cold. The working rooms, the study, the map room, the council chamber, were where everything actually happened, and they were warm and used, and full of the particular energy of decisions being made. She did not see Adrian at meals the first 3 days. He was present in the stronghold. She could feel the quality of attention shift in a room when he passed through it, the way a household's ambient awareness reorganized itself around its alpha. But he did not seek her out, and she did not seek him. She used the time. Marin, who had initially assessed her with neutral caution, shifted to something closer to respect on the 2nd day when Bonnie appeared in the kitchen at dawn, rolled up her borrowed sleeves, and asked Osric if he needed help with the morning preparation. He had looked at her with deep skepticism. She was a guest. She was clearly gentry. She was wearing a dress that didn't fit properly and had arrived in a wedding gown. And then he had handed her a bowl and told her to start the porridge without further ceremony, because Osric was the kind of man who believed capability was demonstrated rather than discussed. She made the porridge. Then she made the bread. Then, because Osric's assistant had sprained his wrist the day before, she stayed and helped with the midday preparation as well. And by the time the afternoon light was coming through the kitchen's high windows, something had settled between them that was not quite friendship, but was the specific mutual regard of 2 people who understood each other's standards. Theo, meanwhile, had discovered the library. This was not a surprise. Theo had always moved toward books the way some children move toward water, instinctively, happily, with complete disregard for anything else in the vicinity. By the 3rd day, he had arranged himself in a corner of the upper library room with a stack of texts on natural philosophy and the particular contentment of a boy who had been half-starved of proper learning for 2 years and was now in a room full of it. Adrian found him there on the 4th morning and sat across from him and talked to him about what he was reading for the better part of an hour, which Bonnie discovered later through Theo's enthusiastic account at supper. She did not know what to do with this information, so she put it aside carefully and did not take it out again until she was alone. On the 5th day, Sarah brought news from the south. Bonnie was in the study. Adrian had made it available to her without comment, simply telling Marin to ensure she had access, and she had spent 2 evenings there with the political maps and the land registry documents he had provided, building the clearest picture she could of the legal situation around Aldenmere. When Sarah came in with the expression of a woman carrying information she had assessed and considered, and was now delivering efficiently. Edmund Voss had formally withdrawn his land claim. The public record gave no reason. Privately, Sarah said, word from Voss Hall's own staff was that the Alpha King's inquiry had arrived with sufficient weight to make continued pursuit inadvisable. Edmund had also, within 48 hours of the dissolved wedding, formalized his bond with Cecily Harrow in a private ceremony attended by immediate family. No council notification, no formal announcement. The speed of it, Sarah said, suggested the arrangement had been in place considerably longer than anyone had officially acknowledged. Bonnie listened to all of this and felt something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not grief, but a clear and quiet relief. The sensation of a door closing that she had not realized was still open. "And Heloise?" she asked. Sarah's expression shifted slightly. "Still at Aldenmere. She's been in correspondence with 2 other pack families since Voss withdrew. Looking for another arrangement, the thinking goes. The estate is still technically under her management, because your father's will named her executor until you married." "I know." Bonnie looked at the map in front of her, at the small northern territory marked Aldenmere, modest in size, significant in what lay beneath its hills. "We need to move before she finds another buyer." "Yes," Sarah said simply. "We do." That evening, Adrian came to the study. She was still at the desk when he arrived, the lamp burning low, the fire reduced to coals. She had been so focused on the land registry cross-referenced with her father's journal that she had not noticed the hour until he set a fresh lamp on the corner of the desk, and she looked up, and the window behind him was entirely dark. "You've been in here since this morning," he said. "I found a discrepancy in the land registry. The northern boundary of Aldenmere was redrawn 18 months ago. I don't have a record of my father approving that change, which means either it was done without his knowledge, or it was done after his death and backdated," Adrian said. He sat in the chair across from the desk, not looking at the map, but at her. "We found the same discrepancy 3 weeks ago. It's one of the items in the formal inquiry." She looked at him. "You've been building this case for weeks. Longer. Before you came to Voss Hall." "Yes." She sat back. Outside, the pine forest was moving in the night wind, that same long exhalation she had heard from his study window on the first night, the sound of something very old and very patient. "You came to Voss Hall because you already knew what Heloise and Voss were doing." "I came because I had documentation of fraud and conspiracy against a noble line. What I didn't know," he paused, and the pause had weight, "was the extent, the physician's preparation, the timeline, the boy as collateral." Something moved in his gray eyes. "Those were not in my documents. Would it have changed what you did? I would have arrived sooner." She believed him. That was the thing she kept arriving at. Despite every reasonable argument she made to herself about caution and experience, and the particular danger of trusting powerful men, simply because they were quieter about their power than the last ones, she kept believing him. Not blindly. She watched him too carefully for it to be blind. But in the specific way one believes evidence that has been tested. She reached into the collar of her dress and drew out the iron key. "I need to go to Aldenmere," she said. "The chest. The original deed and my father's private correspondence. If Eloise is already looking for another buyer, she may eventually find the chest herself. She's had 2 years to search and hasn't, which means she doesn't know it exists, but that won't hold indefinitely. I'll send Sarah and 4 of my guard," he said. "You'll go by the North Road, which adds half a day but avoids the main Voss territory. I'm going myself. I know." He said it without argument. "That's why I said you, not they." Something loosened slightly in her chest. She had been braced for negotiation, for the particular condescension of men who protected women by removing their agency. He had not done that. He simply adjusted the plan to include her presence as a given. "Theo stays here," she said. "Agreed. Morin will look after him." She nodded, started to roll the map, stopped. "Adrian." She said his name carefully, the way one handles something that has become more significant than expected. "What you said the first night, that there were things you could tell me that I wouldn't believe yet." She looked up at him. "I've been here 5 days. I've watched how you run this household. I've watched how you speak to Theo, and to Morin, and to Sarah. I've watched you give me access to your study and your maps and your documents without asking what I intend to do with them. I'm not the same person I was in that corridor." A pause. "I'm ready to hear it." He was quiet for a long moment. The lamp between them burned steadily. "When I walked into that corridor at Voss Hall," he said slowly, "and you came around the corner, you were in a ruined ceremony and you smelled of winter roses and cold stone, and you looked at me like a woman calculating odds, and something in me." He stopped. Started again. "I have been Alpha King for 11 years. I have met my share of people. I have never in 11 years had that particular reaction to a person's presence." She held very still. "I'm not telling you what to do with that information," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm aware of what you've just come from, and I'm aware that the word mate probably sounds like a chain right now, rather than a choice." His eyes were steady on hers. "I just thought you should know what it is, when you notice it. If you notice it." The fire had gone to coals. The lamp made a small warm circle in the dark room. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she hadn't been in years, aware of the distance across the desk between them, aware that she was sitting very still, and that the stillness was not the cold kind she used for protection, but something else entirely, something that had no name yet, and therefore no defense. "I've noticed," she said quietly. "I just don't know what to do with it yet." "That's a fair answer," he said. He stood, picked up the old lamp that had burned low, left her the new one. "The North Road," he said from the doorway. "We leave at first light." She looked at the key in her hand, at the map, at the door where he had been. Then she went back to work, because there was still a great deal to do, and feeling things she had learned could be scheduled for later. But the warmth in the room felt different than it had before, and she did not entirely think it was the lamp. They reached Aldenmere on the second afternoon, coming in through the north field where the land rose toward the iron hills, and the old pine markers her father had planted along the boundary still stood, gray and patient in the winter light. Bonnie had not been back since the funeral. The house looked the same from the outside. Stone, 2 stories, a garden that had been neglected since the head gardener left, and entirely different in the way that places look different when one has stopped belonging to them. Sarah had sent word ahead through channels Bonnie didn't know, and Heloise was not present. A young housemaid let them in, nervous, twisting her apron, and told them quietly that the Lady Heloise had departed 2 days prior for a meeting with a family in the east, and was not expected back until the week's end. Bonnie walked through the house with her key in her hand, and Adrian a measured distance behind her, close enough to be present, far enough to let her lead. The library smelled of dust and disuse. The lower shelf, the chest, dark wood, unremarkable unless one knew to look. The key fit. The lock opened with the solid, definitive sound of a mechanism that had been waiting a long time for the right hands. Inside, her father's seal. The original land deed, signed and witnessed. 23 letters in her father's hand, addressed to a council advocate in the capital, detailing his concerns about Heloise's conduct in the year before his death. A separate document. And here Bonnie's hands went still. A formal notation, witnessed by 2 elders, stating that in the event of his death, the guardianship of his son Theodore and the management of Aldenmere were to pass not to his wife, but to his daughter Bonnie, provided she reached 21 years of age, unmarried or widowed. She had turned 23 in October. She looked at the document for a long time. Then she looked up at Adrian, who was reading it from where he stood without touching it, and whose expression had gone very precise and very still. "She knew," Bonnie said. "Heloise knew about this document. That's why she needed me married. Because married, this clause was void. As a wife, I had no independent legal standing to claim guardianship." "Yes," Adrian said. "And if I died shortly after the wedding, Voss would hold the land. Heloise would receive her payment. Theo would have no legal protector and no estate." He looked at her. "She planned it across 3 years, Bonnie." The name in his mouth was quiet and precise, the way he said everything, and she felt it in a way that had nothing to do with the document in her hands. She folded her father's letters carefully, put everything back in the chest, closed it and held the key. "I want to bring her before the High Council," she said. Her voice was level. "Formally, publicly. I want every Pack family that was considering doing business with her to watch it happen." "That can be arranged," Adrian said, "within the month." She stood up from the library floor, looked around the room where her father had read to her and Theo on winter evenings, where she had first learned that books were a kind of company that never left. "I want to go home," she said. It surprised her. The word home, the way it had redirected itself somewhere in the past 5 days, and was now pointing north, toward stone walls and pine forest, and a kitchen that smelled of good bread. "I want to go back to Kereth, and I want to finish this properly." Adrian held out his hand for the chest. She gave it to him. And when their hands were close in the transfer, close enough that the warmth of him reached her across the cold library air. She did not step back. She let herself feel it, just for a moment. Scheduled for later, had arrived a little early. The High Council of the Northern Pax convened 3 weeks later in the Great Chamber of Caerath, a room Bonnie had not yet entered, which had the particular gravity of spaces that had witnessed centuries of consequential decisions and had absorbed something of that weight into their stones. She dressed carefully that morning. Marin had arranged proper clothing during the weeks of preparation. Not ivory, not borrowed wool, but a deep charcoal dress with a fitted bodice and long sleeves, a dark green cloak lined in fur, boots that fit. Her hair pinned back with the plain silver clasp that had been her mother's, recovered from Aldenmere along with the chest's contents. Nothing elaborate. Nothing designed to perform. Just the specific presentation of a woman who had decided to take up the space she was owed. Theo stood in the doorway of her chamber while she finished, watching her with their father's pale eyes. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "No," she said. Then, because he deserved honesty. "A little. Not of them. Of wanting something too much and watching it go wrong again." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Father used to say that wanting things correctly was not the same as wanting them too much." She looked at him. He was taller than he had been 2 months ago, or perhaps simply less compressed by circumstances. His jacket fit. He had color in his face. He had been studying with a tutor Adrian had arranged without announcement, a man of 60 who specialized in natural science and treated Theo's questions as the serious inquiries they were. "When did you get wise?" she asked. "I've always been wise," he said, with the specific dignity of a 12-year-old who knew exactly how funny he was being. "You just weren't paying attention." She laughed. It came out fully, without reservation, and she realized it was the first time she had laughed like that in longer than she could immediately calculate. The council chamber held 23 representatives, pack alphas, their seconds, 2 independent elders, who held no territory, and therefore held no bias, and the High Council's own advocate, a lean woman named Dara, who had the eyes of someone who had heard every possible lie, and had long stopped being surprised by new configurations of the same ones. Eloise was brought in by 2 of Adrian's guard. Bonnie had prepared herself for this moment, had thought about it during the North Road journey, during the evenings in the study with the maps, during the nights when she lay awake in the warm room at Caerath, listening to the pine forest, and cataloging what she felt, and what she intended, and keeping the 2 things properly separate. She had prepared herself, and still, seeing Heloise walk into that chamber, composed pearl earrings in place, dressed in the gray silk she wore for formal occasions, her expression carrying the particular performance of a woman who had decided that her best defense was absolute dignity. Something tightened in Bonnie's chest. Not grief. Not anymore. Something colder and more useful. The advocate Dara read the charges. Fraud. Conspiracy to misappropriate a noble estate. Manipulation of a ward's marital arrangements for financial gain. Conspiracy to cause harm to a ward. Falsification of land boundary records. Withholding of a legal guardianship document. The charges came in sequence, each one adding to the last, and with each one the chamber grew quieter in a specific way, the quiet of people doing arithmetic and arriving at a sum that was worse than they had expected. Heloise's advocate, she had brought one, a man from the Eastern families who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the reading continued, attempted 3 procedural objections. Dara addressed each one with the flat efficiency of someone swatting flies during an important conversation, and proceeded. Then Dara asked Bonnie to present the documents. She stood, walked to the center of the chamber, placed her father's chest on the council table, and unlocked it with the iron key. Laid out the deed, the letters, the guardianship notation, the boundary records with their falsified revisions marked in red by the council's own surveyor. She did not look at Heloise while she did this. Not because she was afraid to, but because she had decided, somewhere in the 3rd week of preparation, that Heloise did not deserve the significance of her direct attention. She spoke to the council. She answered Dara's questions clearly and without embellishment. She presented her father's handwriting and let it speak for what it was. A man who had seen what was coming and done the one thing within his power, which was to leave his daughter a locked chest and a key, and the knowledge of where to find them. When she finished and returned to her seat, she allowed herself one glance at Heloise. Heloise was looking at the key. Her composure had not broken. She was too practiced for that. But something behind her eyes had shifted, the specific expression of a person who has just understood that the thing they believe safely buried has been recovered and is now lying on a table in a room full of witnesses. It was not quite fear. It was the recognition of consequence, arriving at last. The council deliberated for 2 hours. Bonnie waited in an anteroom with Theo and Sarah, and Adrian came in once during that time and stood near the window without speaking, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done because it required nothing from her and provided the particular steadiness of a presence that was simply there. The verdict came just before the afternoon light began to fail. Heloise was stripped of all rights to Aldenmere and its attached territories. Her assets, to the extent they derived from the Aldenmere estate, were to be returned to the rightful heir. Criminal charges regarding conspiracy to harm would be referred to the High Alpha's judicial authority for separate proceedings. Her advocate, to no one's visible surprise, declined to contest the ruling. The guardianship document was formally recognized. Aldenmere and the secondary title attached to it were declared restored to Bonnie's name, with Theodore's future rights secured in the council record. Elder Crane, old, dry parchment-voiced, present at both her father's funeral and her ruined wedding, affixed his seal to the restoration document last. He looked at her over the table as he did and said, in a voice that carried the specific weight of an old man who had seen a great many things and was giving this one its due acknowledgement, "Your father would have been satisfied." It was not effusive. It was not sentimental. It was exactly true, which made it the most valuable thing anyone said to her that day. That evening, the formal dinner Adrian's household prepared was not celebratory in the loud sense. No excessive toasting, no performance of triumph. Simply good food and warm light, and the particular ease of people who had done difficult work and arrived somewhere worth arriving. Osric had made bread. Bonnie had been in the kitchen that morning. Old habit, genuine need to do something with her hands, and had helped him with the preparation, and the bread on the table was the product of both of them, which pleased her in a way she didn't try to make logical. Theo ate with the appetite of a boy whose worry had been lifted, which was to say with systematic dedication and minimal conversation. Sarah talked with Marin about the logistics of the coming weeks. The guard captain reported briefly that Edmund Voss had sent a formal letter of apology to the council, which everyone at the table received with the collective expression of people who found the information marginally interesting and entirely irrelevant. Adrian was at the head of the table. He spoke when spoken to, and listened when not, which was his way, and at one point during the meal he caught her eye across the table and said nothing, only looked at her with that specific steadiness, and she understood that the question still open between them was not forgotten, only patient. She understood that she was not yet ready to answer it completely. She also understood that she was considerably closer than she had been. After the table was cleared and Theo had retired, exhausted and satisfied, and the household had settled into its evening rhythms, she found Adrian in the corridor outside the library. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular, and when she came around the corner he straightened without surprise. "I owe you something," she said. "You don't." "I do. Not gratitude. I know you don't want gratitude and I don't particularly want to give it, because what you did was simply right and right things shouldn't require a debt. But I owe you honesty." She stopped in front of him. The corridor was lit by a single torch, warm and unsteady, the kind of light that makes shadows out of everything and softens what it touches. "I've been deciding whether to trust you since the moment you held out your cloak in that hallway. I've been watching you with Theo and Marin and Osric and your guard, and I've been reading your documents and watching you let me into every room of this house that mattered. and I've been listening to you say my name and trying to figure out if the way it sounds means what I think it means. A pause. It does, doesn't it? Yes, he said, simple and direct, as always. I'm not easy, she said. I want you to understand that. I'm not frightened anymore exactly, but I'm careful, and I'll be careful for a long time, probably, because the last version of this felt like safety and wasn't. And I don't recover from things by forgetting them. I recover from them by understanding them. She looked at him steadily. I'm telling you this because if you intend to be patient with me, you should know what you're being patient with. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. In the torchlight, his gray eyes were darker than usual, and the scar along his jaw was visible. And he looked like what he was, a man who had been doing difficult things for a long time and had accumulated both the damage and the settledness of it. And she found that she did not want a different version. She wanted precisely this one. I've been Alpha King for 11 years, he said. I have negotiated with war councils and survived 2 succession challenges and managed a territory of 11 packs through a drought and a border conflict and a plague year. The corner of his mouth moved. I think I can manage careful. She laughed again. The second full laugh in one day, which might have been a record. He reached out, very slowly, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear that had come loose from the silver clasp. His hand was warm. He did not hurry, and he did not linger. And when his hand came back to his side, she felt the absence of it, the way one feels the absence of warmth when stepping away from a fire. The bond, she said quietly. I feel it. I've felt it since the courtyard, I think. Only I was calling it something else. A pause. I'm not ready to formalize it. Not yet. I need time. My own name on my own door. A few months of knowing that what I am is mine before I choose to share it. Yes, he said. Just yes. What else would I say? She studied him. Most men would argue. I'm not most men. No, she said. You're really not. She stepped back, adjusted the dark green cloak around her shoulders, looked at him once more, this man who had come into a cold corridor and held out a cloak without asking for anything, who had given her a study full of maps and a kitchen and a library and a fair fight, and had waited through all of it, without using the waiting as leverage. Good night, Adrian, she said. Good night, Bonnie. She walked down the corridor toward the warm room with the fire and the heavy wool blankets, and she carried the feeling with her the way one carries a lamp. Carefully, because it was real, and it was hers, and she did not intend to drop it. In the months that followed, things settled into their proper shapes the way things do when the wrong arrangements have finally been dismantled, and the true ones are allowed to stand. Heloise faced the High Alpha's Judicial Council in the spring. The proceedings were thorough and public, and the verdict was proportionate. A formal stripping of all noble title, a period of supervised custody, and a permanent bar from legal guardianship of any person. She did not speak to Bonnie during the proceedings. Bonnie did not require her to. She had said everything she needed to say in that locked chest library, and Heloise's silence was, in the end, its own kind of answer. Edmund Voss remained in his territory with Cecily Harrow, who became his formally recognized mate in the spring ceremony. Whatever Bonnie felt about this could be accurately described as nothing in particular, which was the most complete form of resolution she could have hoped for. Aldenmere was restored. Bonnie made 3 visits in the spring and summer, each time bringing Theo, each time finding the house a little more itself, the garden recovering, the staff rebuilding, the iron hills in the north left as her father had left them, undeveloped, because she had read his letters and understood his reasoning and agreed with it. She had a legal steward appointed to manage the daily affairs. She was not ready to live there again, and she was honest enough with herself to know that this was not only about practicality. Her home, by that point, had a north road and a pine forest and a kitchen, where Osric argued with her about bread temperature with the comfortable ferocity of a man who had accepted her completely. Theo began proper studies under 2 tutors. He grew. He asked questions that made the tutors write to Adrian with expressions of impressed bewilderment, which Adrian showed to Bonnie with the specific, quiet satisfaction of a man who had been right about something and was not going to say so unnecessarily. By summer's end, Theo stood straight and laughed loudly, and had the look of a boy who had decided, without making a formal announcement of it, that he was going to be all right. The bond between Bonnie and Adrian grew the way she had asked it to. Slowly, honestly, in the daily texture of a shared life that had not been performed or forced. It grew in the study over maps, in the kitchen over bread, in the library where she read, and he occasionally interrupted her with a question, and she occasionally interrupted him, and neither of them apologized for it. It grew in the evenings when the pine forest breathed outside the windows, and the fire settled, and there was no requirement to be anything other than present. In the autumn, on an evening when the first frost had come, and the stronghold smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and the particular cold sweetness of late apples from the kitchen stores, she went to find him in the study, and found him already watching the door, as if he had known she was coming. She supposed by then that he had. She sat across from him, in the chair that had become her chair by habit and mutual acknowledgement, and looked at the fire for a moment, and then looked at him. "I'm ready," she said. He didn't ask what she meant. He knew. He had always known and had never used the knowing as pressure. And that, more than anything, was the reason she was sitting in that chair saying those words. "Are you certain?" he asked, not doubting her, giving her the dignity of the question, so that when she answered it, it was a complete choice. "I'm certain," she said. The formalization of a mate bond, in the old tradition, required no ceremony, no witnesses, no performance. It required only that both parties acknowledge it freely and completely, in full knowledge of what they were choosing. They sat by the fire in the working study, with its maps and its books and its comfortable disorder, and they spoke the old words quietly, to each other. And the bond settled into place, not like a chain, and not like a cage, but like something finally correctly named. A thing that had always been true, recognized at last in its proper form. Afterward, the fire was the same fire, the room was the same room. Outside, the pine forest moved in the night wind. She felt different the way one feels different after setting down something very heavy. Not diminished, but expanded, as if the space previously occupied by guarding had opened into something larger. He reached across and took her hand. She let him, turned her palm up and laced her fingers through his. And they sat by the fire for a long time, in the specific silence of people who have arrived somewhere real and do not feel the need to narrate it. The following spring, when the council formally recorded the bond between the Alpha King and the Lady of Aldenmere, Elder Crane signed the document with his silver pen and remarked in his dry parchment voice that it was the most sensible arrangement he had witnessed in 30 years of council service. No one disagreed. Bonnie wore charcoal and green to the recording, the same colors she had worn to Eloise's judgment, because they were hers, and she liked them, and she had earned the right to wear what she chose. She kept the iron key on its chain against her skin, not because she needed it anymore, but because it was her father's, and it had done its work, and some things deserved to be kept. Theo, 13 now, and approximately 4 inches taller than anyone had anticipated, stood beside her and managed to appear both dignified and insufferably pleased with himself, which was an expression she recognized because their father had worn it at every occasion where something had gone correctly after a long time of going wrong. Adrian stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back, present and unhurried, the way he had always been. He did not speak during the formality, but she felt him the way one feels ground underfoot. Steady, real, unconditionally there. When the advocate Dara finished reading the record and looked up, she looked at Bonnie directly, and there was something in the lean woman's face that might, in a different woman, have been warmth. "Is there anything you wish to add to the record?" Dara asked. Bonnie considered. Only that the Lady of Aldenmere is also a capable cook, she said, in case it's relevant. Theo made a sound that was entirely undignified. Adrian's hand, warm at her back, pressed once, very slightly, and she felt through that small pressure the contained amusement of a man who was going to be laughing about this for a very long time, quietly, to himself, in the way of a person who has found something he intends to keep. She had walked out of a ruined wedding with nothing but a key and a borrowed cloak. She stood now with her name on the legal record, her brother's future secured, her father's land restored and his memory honored, and a man beside her who had asked nothing of her except that she be exactly who she was. The rest, as they say, was theirs to keep.